Just a floor nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her that first morning, voice dripping like spoiled honey across the break room where 3 other nurses pretended not to hear. Just a floor nurse. Like Rachel Torres was furniture. Like she was something to move past without seeing. He didn't know. None of them knew. Rachel Torres kept her eyes down as she moved through Oak Creek Memorial in Portland, the temp nurse nobody bothered to learn the name of, exactly how she needed it. The ICU hummed with the particular silence of machines keeping broken people alive, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeped in patterns only trained ears recognized, and the antiseptic smell hung in the air like a promise and a threat combined. She changed dressings with unusual speed, her fingers moving in patterns that seemed rehearsed beyond any hospital training manual. Her scrubs were always pressed. Her ponytail always tight. Her voice always measured, never climbing, never demanding. A thin scar ran from her left temple to her jaw, pale as old lightning. When patients asked, she said car accident and changed the subject. The truth lived in a locker on the 3rd floor, wrapped in paper she hadn't opened in 3 years. Combat boots. Size 9. Leather worn soft as cloth at the heels. Tied together with a ribbon she refused to call anything but a ribbon. Next to them sat a citation she could recite from memory but would never read aloud, for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres pulled 11 men from a burning field hospital while sniper rounds impacted the concrete 6 inches from her position. The Navy Cross didn't breathe. Didn't speak. Didn't ask her name in the hospital corridors. That was 3 years ago. Before the Pentagon called. Before they told her to disappear. Before she became someone else entirely. Dr. Hargrove arrived for morning rounds at 0630, his expensive shoes clicking against linoleum like a metronome counting down. Italian leather. $200 at minimum. He moved through the ICU with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing everyone below you will scramble to make space. His eye scanned the morning flow, vital signs, chart notes, the tiny hierarchy of who mattered and who didn't. He stopped at Rachel's station, picked up the major's intake file, and smiled the way predators smile before feeding. "Make sure our guest from Tikrit is comfortable," Hargrove said, not looking at her. "Just a nurse." The dismissal was so complete she almost wasn't there. "But let's not overtax your particular skill set. Just follow protocols, sweetheart. I know thinking isn't in your training." Rachel's hand stayed steady. She didn't look up from the vital signs monitor. Her jaw didn't clench. There was no trembling in her shoulders, no heat rising in her chest. Instead, she simply breathed, one measured breath, and nodded the way temp nurses nod. Invisible. Compliant. Exactly what he expected. He left. The clicking of his shoes faded down the corridor. The major arrived at 1,400 hours on a stretcher from the trauma bay. 34 years old. Built the way men are built when their job involves carrying other men over hostile terrain. Brown eyes that had seen things these fluorescent lights would never know. Shrapnel the size of a pencil eraser lodged 2 centimeters from his left anterior descending artery, close enough to kill him if it shifted. Close enough that every movement was calculated, controlled, a conversation with his own mortality. Rachel was assigned his case at handoff. No preamble. No explanation. Just Hargrove's dismissive gesture toward the bed. The major's family was there. Wife. 2 kids under 10. They sat in the corner like soldiers holding a perimeter, waiting for someone to tell them their father was going to die or going to live. Hargrove swept in at 15:30, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape he'd convinced himself he deserved. "Your husband is fortunate," Hargrove announced to the wife, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man who practiced sincerity in mirrors. "We have the best ICU in Portland. And the best staff." He gestured vaguely toward Rachel, standing beside the four-rack. "Though some of our nurses are, shall we say, more experienced than others. This one is temporary. You understand?" The wife's face tightened. The kids stared. Rachel continued adjusting the saline drip. Her hands didn't pause. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't say a word. The composure was so absolute it became a kind of weapon. The refusal to acknowledge his cruelty was its own form of defiance, but he would never recognize it as such because recognition required him to see her as something capable of defying. The dressing needs changing every 4 hours, Hargrove continued, speaking to the family but loud enough for the whole unit to hear. Make sure you request one of the senior nurses if possible. These temporary assignments can be unpredictable. Rachel finished with the 4. Checked the monitor one last time, BP stable at 118/72, O2 sat holding at 97%, and stepped back. Her face was blank as professional as a surgeon's mask. The family watched her with the particular distrust Hargrove had just planted in their minds like a seed. By 1900 hours, she'd changed the Major's dressing 4 times. Not because it needed changing. Because the man had watched her hands work the first time and his eyes had gone wide in a way that made him dangerous. "That's a Kandahar zip stitch," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Where the hell did a floor nurse learn forward surgical? Rachel's hands had stilled for exactly half a second. Not long enough for anyone watching to see. She was reaching for clean gauze when he said it, and her fingers simply paused in the space between 2 movements. The room held its breath. The ventilator across the unit wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, a code blue alarm started wailing, urgent and terrible. She met his stare. One measured breath. Her voice came out steady as surgical steel. "I didn't." One tear escaped. Just one. But she wiped it without looking away, and in that single gesture the Major understood something that would fracture everything Dr. Hargrove had spent the day building. This woman wasn't a floor nurse. This woman wasn't temporary. This woman had held lives together in places where the power grid failed and the screaming never stopped, and she was working in an ICU in Portland because someone had told her to disappear. The silence stretched between them, 3 seconds, 4, 5. It was the kind of silence that comes from 2 people recognizing each other across an unbridgeable distance. She finished the dressing change without speaking again. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, from repetition in rooms lit by emergency flares instead of fluorescent lights. When she was done, she stepped back and adjusted the monitors one final time. The Major's eyes followed her to the door, and he understood with absolute clarity that the man who had spent the day diminishing her had just made a very serious mistake. Rachel pulled the door closed behind her and headed for the supply room. The night shift was beginning. Hargrove would leave at 1800, heading to his country club or his second home or wherever men like him went to celebrate their own superiority. The unit would quiet. The machines would maintain their mechanical breathing. And in her locker on the 3rd floor, a pair of worn combat boots sat wrapped in a citation about a woman the Pentagon had erased from every database 3 years ago. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and microwaved fish, the refrigerator humming its mechanical drone as Rachel sat down at the scarred plastic table with her sandwich. Jennifer was mid-sentence about her daughter's soccer tournament, Marcus nodding along while Keisha scrolled through her phone, their voices layered and easy the way people talk when they belong to each other. Rachel set her lunch down. The silence took exactly 2 seconds to arrive. Jennifer's phone buzzed. She checked it, stood, gathered her things. "Oh, I just remembered I have to call pharmacy." She left without looking back, her chair scraping against linoleum like a warning. Marcus followed within 30 seconds, something about needing to check on a patient in room for 12. Keisha remained for another heartbeat, her fingers still moving across her screen, before she too collected her half-eaten yogurt and walked out, the break room door swinging shut with a soft click that sounded like a lock. Rachel chewed her sandwich with mechanical precision. Turkey and mustard. No emotion. No reaction. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the exhausted hum of fluorescent lights everywhere, and she ate each bite knowing exactly what had just happened, knowing it would happen again tomorrow, and the day after that. This was how erasure worked in a hospital. Not with shouting or confrontation, but with the simple act of people deciding you were not worth staying for. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Rachel walked past the unit disciplinary board in the hallway outside the charge nurse's station. Her name appeared under a new section, Documentation Errors. 3 incidents listed. Improper vital signs notation on chart 4473. Medication administration timing discrepancy on chart 4501. Incomplete patient assessment documentation on chart 4689. None of them accurate. All of them fabricated. She stood there for 7 seconds, reading her own manufactured failure, while staff members passed by without meeting her eyes. The charge nurse, Sarah, was visible through the glass partition of her office. She glanced up, saw Rachel staring at the board, and deliberately looked away. Sarah had been kind 2 weeks ago. Sarah had asked Rachel about her weekend. Sarah had stopped existing in Rachel's universe the moment Hargrove's preference became clear. Rachel's hands were steady as she turned away from the board. Her voice was steady when she checked on patients. Her movements were precise as she administered medications. But that night, sitting in her locker area during a quiet moment at 8 p.m., she allowed her fingers to touch the worn combat boots wrapped in old newspaper on the bottom shelf. The leather was cracked from 3 years of storage, the sole still marked with red dust from a base in Kandahar province. She didn't open the newspaper. She didn't need to see the citation again. She already knew what it said. She already knew who she had been. The question was who she was now, and the answer was becoming harder to remember. The unit was understaffed that night. A nurse called in sick, another picked up extra hours in the ER, and Rachel found herself assigned to 6 patients instead of the usual 4. Hargrove had approved the assignment himself, she noticed. The charge nurse had looked almost sympathetic when she handed Rachel the assignment sheet. Almost, but not quite. Around midnight, Rachel was changing the major's dressing. His incision was healing well, minimal signs of infection, the edges clean and properly approximated. She worked with the same precision she had learned in military field hospitals in Helmand Province and Logar Province, her hands moving through the motions of wound care the way a violinist moves through a concerto, muscle memory made visible, every motion serving a specific purpose. And then her hands shifted. Without conscious decision, her fingers began executing a modified suturing technique, a specific pattern used on forward surgical teams for shrapnel wounds where speed and tissue preservation meant survival. The Kandahar zip stitch. A technique taught to her by a Navy surgeon named Dr. Reeves in a field hospital that no longer officially existed. The major's eyes opened. He stared at her hands. His voice came out sharp, alert, the voice of someone who had recognized something he shouldn't have encountered in a civilian hospital in Portland, Oregon. That's a Kandahar zip stitch, where the hell did a floor nurse learn forward surgical? Rachel's hands froze for exactly 1 second. Then she completed the stitch, cut the suture material with deliberate care, and placed a fresh dressing over the wound with movements that looked routine, unremarkable, entirely within the scope of standard nursing practice. She took one measured breath and her voice came out flat as glass, the voice of someone answering a routine question about procedure. I didn't. One tear escaped her eye. She wiped it without looking away from the dressing, without breaking eye contact with the major. Her jaw was clenched but her hands remained steady. She had spent 3 years learning how to disappear, how to be invisible, how to reduce herself to the smallest possible footprint. 1 tear was acceptable. 1 tear was something she could control. The major stared at her for 7 long seconds. Something was shifting behind his eyes, a calculation happening in the space where surprise and recognition met. But Rachel had already begun breaking down the equipment, already begun moving toward the door with the efficiency of someone who had many other patients to see, many other tasks to complete, many other reasons to stop standing in this room. She made it to the hallway before she allowed herself to breathe. The files were the second blow. Rachel discovered them the next morning while reviewing the electronic health record system during her shift. Phantom imaging charges. 17 of them over the past 3 weeks. CAT scans, ultrasounds, MRIs, all billed to patients in the ICU, none of them actually performed. The imaging codes were entered into the system, the billing codes attached to insurance claims, the reimbursements diverted into a pattern that took Rachel only 12 minutes to trace back to a single account. Hargrove's consulting practice. His private imaging company that didn't perform imaging. She documented the discrepancies in writing. She followed protocol, putting the information into an email to the compliance office with carbon copies to the hospital administrator and the quality assurance director. She used precise language, non-accusatory tone, nothing that could be construed as insubordination or overstepping her authority. Just a floor nurse noting a pattern in the billing codes. The response came back within 2 hours, * will look into it. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. *. Nobody ever looked into it. By the afternoon, Rachel's name had been systematically removed from the major's assignment. He was transferred to another nurse, Jennifer, who had abandoned her at lunch. Rachel overheard the charge nurse making the reassignment, something vague about workload balancing and experience considerations. What it actually meant was that Rachel would no longer be his primary care provider. What it actually meant was that she would no longer have direct access to his case, no longer be the bridge between the major and the doctors, no longer be the person in the room during rounds. She understood immediately what Hargrove was doing. He was isolating her. He was removing her from the investigation she had just initiated. He was placing her on the disciplinary board. He was orchestrating her removal from the unit piece by piece, professional reason by professional reason, until she would either resign or give him cause to terminate her. This was the third stage of escalation. Not just social mockery anymore. Strategic moves. Weaponized policy. That evening, sitting alone in her locker area, Rachel held the worn combat boots in both hands. They were surprisingly light, as if 3 years of storage had leached them of weight. The leather was cold. The sole still carried traces of red dust no amount of cleaning could remove. These boots had stood on a firebase in Kandahar. These boots had walked through a burning field hospital. These boots had carried her through the worst moment of her life. And she had hidden them like they were evidence of a crime. Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number, * major's monitor is concerning. They're pulling him from cardiac monitoring per Hargrove's orders. Thought you should know. J*. Rachel read the message 3 times. She recognized the number. Jennifer. The same nurse who had abandoned her at lunch was now sending her covert warnings. The same nurse who worked under Hargrove's approval was now admitting that something was wrong with Hargrove's decisions. She closed the locker door gently. She wrapped the boots back in newspaper with movements that were careful, reverent, as if handling something sacred. Then she stood up, straightened her scrubs, and made a decision that started with 3 words spoken softly to herself in the quiet of the locker room. Not today, doctor. The monitor alarm cut through the cardiac unit at 0200 like a siren that changed everything. Rachel stood at the med cart restocking supplies when the first beep became a shriek. She moved without thinking, her feet already carrying her toward the sound before her mind caught up. The major's room. Of course it was the major's room. His blood pressure was collapsing. The numbers on the monitor told the story in neon red, 70/40 and falling. His oxygen saturation dropped with each ragged breath. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, fighting against something it couldn't overcome. Rachel's eyes read the pattern instantly, the way his jugular veins distended, the muffled heart sounds she could almost hear from across the room, the fluid visible on the bedside ultrasound monitor that had been running continuous surveillance since his arrival. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the space around his heart, compressing it, suffocating it. She pressed the code button and watched the unit explode into motion. 3 nurses converged. A resident arrived in 45 seconds. Dr. Hargrove appeared in his pressed shirt and silk tie, coffee cup still in hand, as if responding to an inconvenience rather than a dying patient. "What do we have?" Hargrove asked, not looking at Rachel. 48-year-old Special Forces Major, post-traumatic cardiac tamponade from retained shrapnel fragment, Rachel heard herself say. Her voice came out steady as glass. Pressure 74/38 and dropping. O2 sat 89. We need pericardiocentesis now. Hargrove glanced at the monitor. His expression didn't shift. Call interventional cardiology. We'll have him transferred upstairs for a formal pericardial window. More appropriate. He doesn't have time for transfer, Rachel said. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. That's not your clinical judgment to make, Nurse Torres. Hargrove's voice carried the blade edge she'd come to recognize, the one that made other staff members shrink. Get me Dr. Patel. And stand back. Dr. Patel arrived in 2 minutes, chest heaving from the run. He took one look at the monitor, at the Major's grey face, at the distended neck veins. He looked at Hargrove. This needs pericardiocentesis, Patel said. I'm not authorized for that procedure, Hargrove replied instantly. The words came out smooth, rehearsed. I need a cardiologist present. Call the cath lab attending. The cath lab attending is in surgery. Unavailable for 20 minutes. Then we wait. The Major's oxygen saturation dropped to 85. Dr. Chen was paged next. He arrived, took one glance at the monitor, and started backing toward the door before anyone spoke. This is above my level, he said. You need the attending. The attending is Hargrove, Rachel said quietly. Chen didn't answer. He just left. Dr. Williams came next. He looked at the chart, at the Major's vitals, at Hargrove standing with his arms crossed. He signed a do not resuscitate order, Williams said. Rachel checked the chart. No DNR. The form was blank, the box unsigned. No, he didn't, she said. That's not what I'm seeing, Williams replied, and he walked out. Dr. Okoye appeared last, his face already shaking his head before he entered the room. He took one glance at the situation, at Hargrove's presence, at the monitor, at the reality of what was being asked, and he picked up the phone. Get the chaplain, he said into the receiver. Then he left. 5 doctors. Each one a door closing. The Major's blood pressure hit 68/32. Rachel stood perfectly still for 1 heartbeat. 2. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, the nurses frozen at the bedside, the resident staring at the monitor like it might change if he looked hard enough. She felt the pressure of the seconds collapsing in on themselves like the sack around the Major's heart. Then something shifted inside her? Not panic. The opposite of panic. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved before her mind finished thinking. She grabbed the ultrasound probe from the crash cart and the pericardiocentesis kit, the one she'd restocked for hours ago without thinking about why a cardiac unit kept emergency thoracic supplies on hand. She'd known. Some part of her had always known. She positioned the probe below the Major's xiphoid process, angling it toward his left shoulder. The screen flickered to life. Dark fluid surrounded his heart like a fist squeezing. She could see exactly where the needle needed to go. What are you doing? Hargrove's voice came out sharp. Rachel prepped the site with betadine. The smell of antiseptic filled the small space around her. My job. Step back. That's an order. She didn't step back. Her hands had become something separate from her body, instruments with their own intelligence. She drew up lidocaine, felt the familiar weight of the 18-gauge needle between her fingers. This wasn't a nursing skill. This was muscle memory from a field hospital in Tikrit, from a time when she had held lives in her hands under gunfire and kept them beating through sheer force of will. She advanced the needle between the Major's ribs at a 45-degree angle, watching the ultrasound screen as the tip traced toward the pericardial sac. The hospital room seemed to contract around her, narrowing to just this moment, the needle, the screen, the fluid, the failing heart. The needle breached the membrane. Dark blood filled the syringe. 10 ccs. The Major's breathing hitched. 20 ccs. His chest wall seemed to collapse inward less. 40 ccs. The monitor's alarm tone changed. 60 ccs drawn, and she withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd used to advance it. The Major's blood pressure rose like sunrise breaking over water, 95/60. Then 110/70. His oxygen saturation climbed from 84 to 94 in less than a minute. His eyes flew open, wide and terrified and alive. "Who the hell are you?" His voice came out ragged, desperate, gasping. Rachel held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. She didn't answer. She didn't look away. She set the syringe down on the metal tray with a soft clink and stepped back from the bed. The room was dead silent. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old bone. His coffee cup sat on the counter, untouched and cooling. He looked at the monitor. At the Major. At the evidence of what had just happened arranged on the metal tray like an accusation. "I need that needle documented," he said finally. His voice came out thin. "And you need to come with me to administration." Rachel finished charting the Major's vitals at 0600. His blood pressure held steady at 118/76. His oxygen saturation stayed at 96. The cardiologist from the cath lab had arrived 2 hours earlier to find a patient who no longer needed emergency intervention, just stabilization and monitoring and time. The cardiologist hadn't asked questions. He just read the chart, looked at Rachel, and nodded. The charge nurse appeared at her elbow with a security guard standing 3 feet behind her. The guard's radio crackled softly against his hip. "Dr. Hargrove wants to see you in administration immediately," the charge nurse said. She didn't meet Rachel's eyes. Rachel set down her pen. She gathered her badge and her phone from the locker. She didn't grab the combat boots sitting in the bottom of the locker under her spare scrubs. She wouldn't need them where she was going. Hargrove's office occupied the corner of the 4th floor with mahogany furniture and windows that overlooked the city. The suspension notice was already printed on hospital letterhead, sitting on his desk like a sentence already written. 2 board members sat in leather chairs, the ones who played golf with him every Thursday morning at the club. Rachel knew them by reputation. She'd never spoken to them. "You performed an invasive procedure without attending physician authorization," Hargrove said. He didn't invite her to sit. "You practiced beyond your scope of license. You used equipment and materials not assigned to nursing care." "I saved his life," Rachel said. "You committed a crime. You'll be suspended effective immediately pending investigation by the state licensing board. Your credentials are under review. Security will escort you from the building." Rachel opened her mouth to defend herself. The words assembled themselves in perfect order. She had the knowledge to explain the clinical necessity, the vital signs, the timeline. She had the technical expertise. She had the training. She had nothing else. Because 3 years ago a DevGru operation in Tikrit was buried so deep that Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had been erased from every database. Her name had been redacted. Her service had been classified. She'd been told to disappear, to forget, to become invisible. A lawyer from the Pentagon had handed her a document that promised federal prosecution if she ever revealed her identity or her service record. She wasn't permitted to prove who she had been. She wasn't allowed to explain. She closed her mouth. An investigator from Hospital Risk Management was already photographing her locker when security escorted her down the stairwell. He was cataloguing the contents, her spare scrubs, her label maker, the worn pair of combat boots she'd kept hidden at the bottom for 3 years, the faded unit patch she'd sewn inside her jacket lining. The rain hammered the Portland parking lot like applause as she walked toward her car. The security guard didn't follow her beyond the exit doors. He just watched to make sure she left. His face was the same guard who'd worked security for 6 months, who'd nodded at her in the break room, who'd never asked about the name on her badge. She didn't look back. By morning, the network Hargrove had spent 15 years building activated like a switchboard lighting up in the dark. He knew exactly who to call. He knew exactly what to say. He'd practiced this dance before, just never with stakes this high. The first call came at 7:16 a.m. Patricia Chen's voice on the line was already tired. "James, what's going on?" He told her Rachel Torres had performed a procedure she wasn't qualified for. He said the word liability twice. He said the words our exposure once. By 8:15 a.m., she'd texted him, "I'll talk to Marcus. Board meeting at 4. The second board member, Marcus Webb, didn't even ask questions. He owed Hargrove a favor from a golf tournament 3 years ago where Hargrove had quietly paid for the club membership upgrade Marcus couldn't afford. A text at 8:42 a.m. from Marcus, suspension signed. Ready for the termination paperwork. 2 signatures. That was all it took. By 9:13 a.m., the anonymous complaint had already reached the State Board of Nursing in Salem. Hargrove sat in his office with his door closed, voice steady and careful. "I have concerns about a nurse's credentials. She claims military training she can't document. I'm not making an accusation, I'm just concerned for patient safety." The board clerk wrote it all down. An investigation opened automatically. Rachel Torres, they would tell him later, had no military records available for verification. No DD Form 214. No discharge papers. Nothing. It was as if Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had never existed at all. The hospital risk management investigator arrived at 10:15 a.m. with a camera and an evidence bag. He photographed Rachel's locker under Hargrove's direction, the worn combat boot sitting in the bottom next to her spare scrubs, the faded unit patch she'd stitched inside her jacket lining 3 years ago. They photographed everything. They documented nothing that proved anything. Just images of a temp nurse with military memorabilia who couldn't produce military credentials. The investigator was thorough. He was also being paid. He would testify that the locker contained suspicious items consistent with credential fraud. Rachel arrived for her 2 p.m. shift to find security waiting at the entrance. Not asking. Just waiting. The guard's face was apologetic but his spine was straight. "Ms. Torres, we need you to come with us." Security. The word itself felt like a hand on her shoulder, pressing down. They walked her through the corridors, the same corridors where she'd moved invisible for 3 years, where she'd learned names and held hands and taught junior nurses how to read an EKG without flinching. Every eye followed. No one said anything. The guard handed her a cardboard box containing her personal items, a coffee mug, a half-empty bottle of lotion, 3 protein bars she'd kept in her locker. The box was the size of a tissue dispenser. Her 3 years of work fit in a space smaller than a microwave. "Dr. Hargrove has filed reports with our licensing board about discrepancies in your credentials," the guard said, reading from a statement. "You're suspended effective immediately pending investigation. You're not to return to this facility." His voice had the texture of regret, but his actions had the precision of protocol. This was institutional rejection, wrapped in legality, delivered with apologies. The accusation was waiting in her email by the time she reached her car, practicing beyond scope of license and use of falsified credentials to obtain employment. Hargrove's signature on both. 5 doctors had refused to save the major's life. 1 nurse had done it anyway. And now the entire weight of bureaucracy was moving against her, not because she'd failed, but because she'd succeeded. She couldn't defend herself. That was the cruelest architecture of Hargrove's strategy. 3 years ago, Operation Nightingale had been classified. DivGru medics embedded with indigenous forces in Tikrit had been buried so deep in a compartmentalized system that their names were redacted from databases, their service marked need to know only. She was erased. Officially, Rachel Torres had no military experience. She had no training in advanced trauma procedures. She had no business being in Oak Creek Memorial at all. The Pentagon had told her this would be temporary, 6 months until the political winds shifted. That was 36 months ago. The winds never shifted. She was still erased. She called her lawyer from the parking lot. "The licensing board has initiated a full investigation into your credentials," he said. "Without military discharge papers, without some kind of official documentation, we can't prove your training. We can't prove you were ever. He didn't finish the sentence. They both understood. Without proof, she was a fraud. With the truth classified, she was a ghost. They're asking for your response within 30 days, he said quietly. What do you want to do? She didn't answer. She sat in her car in the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot with a cardboard box of her life on the passenger seat, watching the ER doors open and close, open and close. The afternoon rain started hammering the windshield like applause for someone else's victory. The car filled with the smell of wet asphalt seeping through the vents. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain herself. She couldn't prove herself. This was the architecture of invisibility. Once you're erased, even the truth becomes a lie no one can verify. By 2:06 p.m., she was driving to the VA hospital across town. Thursday was always her day. Thursday was her appointment with Dr. Peterson, the therapist who specialized in what the intake forms called combat-related psychological sequelae, which was the clinical term for the way certain mornings made breathing feel like a negotiation. The waiting room was full of ghosts like her. There was a Marine with a left leg that ended below the knee, the socket of his prosthetic making a soft clicking sound each time he shifted his weight. She'd amputated that leg in a field hospital outside Mosul, had held the tourniquet while blood ran like irrigation water, had told him his name in the dark, "Corporal, don't you dare go silent on me, I need you talking." He didn't recognize her now. His eyes passed over her like she was furniture. Next to him sat an Army Ranger with a tremor in his right hand. RPG fragmentation. She'd placed a chest tube between his ribs while the compound around them burned, had felt the hiss of air escaping, had watched his oxygen saturation climb from 68 to 92 in 30 seconds. He was reading a 6-month-old magazine. He didn't look up. A CB with facial scars that caught the fluorescent light sat in the corner drinking coffee that had to be cold by now. She'd dressed those burns on the second day of the Tikrit deployment, had changed the dressings every 4 hours while the generator hummed and the radio crackled with casualty reports. His scars had faded. Hers hadn't. She was wearing a surgical mask in her memory of that moment, covered in blood so completely that her face was invisible. Her presence was gone. Her skill remained in their healed bodies. Her identity remained classified. Rachel. Dr. Peterson's voice came from the hallway. Come on back. She walked past the Marine, the Ranger, the CB. None of them knew they'd been healed by a ghost. None of them knew they'd been saved by someone whose service was erased. She followed Dr. Peterson into the office where a box of tissue sat on the table, the ritual of broken people confessing to another broken person. The therapist's office painted a color called institutional calm, which was really just the color of surrender. She sat in the chair. She didn't speak. She couldn't speak. The weight of erasure pressed down on her like a sandbag on a hemorrhage, trying to stop the bleeding but only making everything heavier. And then she broke. Not slowly. Not with dignity. She broke the way dams break, all at once, catastrophically, the floodgates opening on 3 years of invisibility, 3 years of being dismissed and erased and doubted, and finally, when she'd saved a man's life, accused of being a fraud. The sobs came from somewhere below her ribs, from the place where muscle memory lived, from the girl who used to be a warrior and was now just a temp nurse with a box of her belongings. That evening, Miguel found her sitting in the dark kitchen, still in her scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and failure. The scrubs had a coffee stain on the sleeve from the morning she'd still believed she had a job. Mom? What happened? Her 17-year-old son, born after she'd been erased, born into the false life she'd constructed. She couldn't answer him. She didn't know how to explain that sometimes the system was designed to erase you twice, once officially, and once again when you tried to prove you'd ever existed. Miguel went to the basement looking for answers. Behind the Christmas decorations, under a stack of photo albums she never opened, he found the wooden case. The case was smaller than he expected. The ribbons inside told a story that contradicted everything he'd ever been told about his mother. That afternoon, the narrative changed. That evening, it would change again. But first came the night of silence, the waiting, the terrible knowledge that everything was about to shatter into proof. Miguel pushed through the hospital board meeting like a man on a mission. The conference room on the third floor of Oak Creek Memorial went quiet the moment he walked in, 17 years old with his mother's eyes and his father's certainty, carrying a wooden case worn smooth by time and basement damp. Dr. Hargrove was mid-sentence, presenting Rachel's termination to board members who nodded along like trained seals, when Miguel set that case down on the mahogany table hard enough that pens jumped. "Mom, they need to see these," he said. His voice didn't shake. He opened the case. The room didn't just go quiet. The air changed. It was like someone had cut the oxygen supply and replaced it with something heavier, something that demanded respect. Ribbons first. Navy and gold. Purple heart colors. Then the medals themselves, lying on faded black velvet like artifacts from a museum nobody was supposed to visit. Bronze stars catching the fluorescent light. A silver star that made one board member lean back as if it had radiated heat. And then, at the bottom of the case, a ribbon so distinctive, so rarely awarded, that a woman in the third seat made a small sound in her throat. A Navy Cross. The board member nearest Miguel's left, a man named Stevens who taught business ethics at Portland State, lifted Rachel's personnel file with hands that trembled like he was holding something alive. He read it aloud because he couldn't trust his own eyes to tell him the truth. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. Navy Cross. 2 bronze stars. 3 purple hearts. His voice went thin. Joint Service Commendation. Presidential Unit Citation. The major stood in the doorway on crutches, his dress uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, the scar on his chest hidden under dress blues that he wore like proof. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a man with a SEAL Team 3 patch and captain's bars and the kind of quiet authority that made the room understand immediately that this man had killed people and would do it again without hesitation. His name was Graves. His call sign was Breaker. He had come from Naval Base Coronado specifically for this meeting. Graves stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Purple Heart," he said, looking directly at Hargrove. The words came out like measured rifle shots. Joint Service Commendation. Another beat. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Presidential Unit Citation. He let that one land, watching Hargrove's face drain color like a sink with the plug pulled. And a Navy Cross. Awarded for pulling 11 Marines out of a burning field hospital in Fallujah under sniper fire while coordinating casualty evacuation for 243 wounded personnel over a 12-hour period. Boots on tile. That was the only sound. Graves walking closer to Hargrove, his dress uniform immaculate, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, a massive, controlled, ready. Senior Chief Torres trained for 8 years to earn those medals. You earned your medical degree in 4. I'd say she's more qualified than you to be in this room. The FBI agent stepped forward. She wore a dark suit and carried a folder thick as a novel. "Dr. Hargrove, I'm Special Agent Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres's records were classified under Operation Nightingale, a Pentagon oversight program for separated special operations medical personnel. Those records are now unclassified as of this morning. She opened the folder. "We will need your billing records for the past 18 months. Hargrove's attorney stood up. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from water. On what grounds? 43 patients, Agent Chen said, not looking at him, still looking at Hargrove. CT scans billed to unconscious ICU patients who never left their beds. MRIs logged in the system with timestamps during hours your imaging department was closed. Equipment logs showing those machines were never turned on. We have emails. We have testimony from your billing assistant. We have radiologists willing to testify that you instructed them to backdate reports for scans that never happened. That's 18 counts of insurance fraud and 4 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud." Hargrove's face wasn't red anymore. It was the color of old bone. The security guard who had escorted Rachel from the building 6 days earlier stood by the door. The same man. His name was Patterson, and he'd looked away when he handed her the cardboard box with her personal items. He didn't look away now. He was holding another box. Hargrove's box. His voice came out flat and professional and absolute. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Hargrove left. His attorney left. The room exhaled like it had been holding its breath underwater. The board members looked at Rachel's medals like they were trying to read a language they'd never learned. Miguel closed the case, gathered it back up, and stepped outside to where his mother was waiting in the hallway, her hand steady, her jaw set like she was running through a mission brief even though the mission was already over. She took the case from him without speaking. The weight of it was familiar. The weight of 3 years compressed into wood and velvet and metal that meant something to people who understood what it cost to earn it. 2 days later, Oak Creek Memorial offered her the position. ICU director. Full-time. Back pay for the suspension. A formal written apology. Rachel sat in the HR director's office on the 2nd floor, the same HR director who had signed off on her termination, who had looked away when they loaded her into that security escort, and listened to an apology delivered 5 times in 3 minutes like a script someone had forced her to memorize, and she was terrified of forgetting any word. Rachel took one measured breath and responded without emotion. "I'll take the position. But I want Jennifer, Marcus, and Keisha reassigned to different units. Not fired. Reassigned. They need to learn that silence is a choice. That silence has a cost." The HR director nodded frantically, relieved to be giving her something, anything, to make this right. 6 months passed like water under a bridge you've already crossed. Hargrove taught CPR classes at Portland Community College now. He wore a polo shirt with the college logo instead of a white coat. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy to students who didn't know his name, who wouldn't have cared if they did. His medical license was gone. The plea deal had cost him his career, his marriage. His wife filed for divorce when reporters camped outside their Laurelhurst home, and 3 years of probation. The money he'd stolen went back to the families whose loved ones had been billed for phantom scans. The hospital settled with 63 families. Rachel didn't attend the settlement conferences. She didn't need to. Justice moving forward was its own kind of evidence. She saw him once, at a medical conference where she was presenting on trauma protocols developed in Tikrit, where the audience of 200 doctors listened with their notebooks open and their minds bent toward learning. He was in the back of the room for exactly 4 minutes. She didn't acknowledge him. He left early. Some people understand when they're not supposed to exist in a room anymore. Rachel stood in her office on the 4th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, the ICU humming beyond her window like a living thing. The pair of worn combat boots sat on her shelf now, polished so clean you could see your reflection, no longer hidden beneath scrub pants and shame, flanked by a photo of Miguel in his high school graduation cap and a thank you card from the major's sister written in handwriting that shook with gratitude. She ran morning rounds with a team of residents who listened when she spoke. They asked questions about the Kandahar zip-stitch technique. They knew exactly who she was. They had looked up Operation Nightingale. They had seen her name in declassified reports. They understood that the quiet woman in the corner wasn't always quiet, wasn't always a corner. Sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one holding everything together. Sometimes she was holding together a room full of lives. The major stopped by on his way to physical therapy, walking without crutches now, the scar on his chest healing pink and clean like new skin learning to breathe. "I'm headed back to Fort Bragg next week. Wanted to say thanks." Rachel nodded once, her voice steady as surgical steel. "Do your exercises. That sternum needs 6 more weeks." He grinned like she'd given him an order instead of permission. "Yes, Senior Chief." The title fit her like a uniform she'd never removed, only hidden. Miguel appeared at lunch with sandwiches from the deli she liked. They ate in her office while she told him stories she'd never told before. About the Marines she'd saved in Fallujah. About the army pilot she'd pulled from a burning helicopter when the fuel lines had split and the world turned orange. About the Iraqi children she'd treated when the insurgents finally withdrew and the medical tent became a place of healing instead of triage. He listened like he was hearing his mother for the first time. Maybe he was. That evening, Rachel walked through the ICU and a new temp nurse was working the medication cart with unusual precision. Quiet. Competent. Invisible. Rachel watched her hands move, saw the way she scanned the room tactically, noticed the thin scar on her forearm that might have been shrapnel, might have been a lot of things. Rachel stopped and watched her work, understanding without words being spoken. You're doing good work. If you need anything, my door's open. The temp nurse met her eyes for 1 second, nodded once, and went back to work. Rachel understood completely. Some heroes walk among us in scrubs, saving lives in the dark, carrying stories they can't tell. Until the day comes when someone finally sees them. If you're a veteran, if you're a military medical professional, if you've ever been told to disappear and told you couldn't prove you'd existed, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and comment your story below. Because heroism doesn't end just because someone orders you to vanish. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it just waits for its moment to surface.